After I excluded my fiancée from the wedding, Mum cut me out of her will and declared me dead. Now half the family is boycotting her wedding. I'm Rachel, 28, and I've been with my fiancé Brian, 30, for 6 years. We first met during our senior year of college, collaborating on a group project for our environmental science class. I was immediately drawn to his passion for conservation and his kind eyes. We quickly became friends, bonding over our shared love for the outdoors and terrible sci-fi movies. Our relationship developed slowly but steadily. Brian was always patient and understanding, never pressuring me to move faster than I was comfortable with. He knew I had trust issues from past relationships, so he gave me the time and space I needed to truly open up. About a year into our relationship, Brian received a diagnosis of Crohn's disease. It was a scary and uncertain time for both of us. I remember sitting in the doctor's office, holding his hand as we listened to the explanation of how this chronic condition would impact his life. Brian was understandably upset and worried about how it would affect our future. However, it only deepened my feelings for him. Witnessing his courage in facing this diagnosis and his determination not to let it define him made me admire him even more. I threw myself into researching his condition, learning everything I could to support him. Of course, there have been tough times. Brian has had a few severe flare-ups that required hospital stays, but we've navigated every challenge together, and it has only brought us closer. Last year, while hiking to our favorite waterfall, Brian insisted on going, even though he wasn't feeling well. He got down on one knee and proposed. It was the easiest yes of my life. Now, for some background on my family situation, my father passed away from pancreatic cancer when I was 12. It was a very quick battle, lasting only about 8 months from diagnosis to his death. Those months were a blur of hospital visits, hushed conversations between my parents that would abruptly stop when I entered the room, and a growing sense of dread I couldn't quite grasp at the time. My father was my hero. He was a high school history teacher whose students adored him for his cheesy dad jokes and genuine enthusiasm for the subject. At home, he was always ready for an impromptu dance party in the kitchen or a late-night ice cream run. Losing him left a huge void in my life. My mother, Emily, now 52, was understandably heartbroken by Dad's passing. For months, she was barely functional. I remember having to remind her to eat and practically begging her to shower. Eventually, she immersed herself in her career as a real estate agent, leaving before I woke up and returning late at night. For years, it was just the two of us rattling around in our oversized house. We became close out of necessity, bonding over our shared grief, but there was always a part of my mother that seemed missing, as if she had buried a piece of herself alongside my father. When I was in high school, my mother started seeing a therapist. I began to see glimpses of her old self returning. She started cooking again. Dad had always been the family chef, but she also took up gardening and even started dating. Nothing serious, just coffee dates here and there. I went to college hoping my mother would finally heal. We talked often, and she was happier than she had been in years. That's why I was overjoyed when, during my sophomore year, she called to tell me she had met someone important, Frank, a 55-year-old man. Frank seemed wonderful at first. He was a successful businessman who radiated charm and confidence. He made my mother laugh in a way I hadn't heard since before Dad died. I was happy for her, but over time, I started noticing things. Frank would make subtle digs at my decision to major in environmental science instead of something practical like business. He'd comment on my appearance, saying things like, "You'd be so pretty if you just put in a little effort." My mother would always brush it off, claiming he was just teasing or that I was being too sensitive. When I introduced Brian to them, I could feel my mother's disapproval. She was polite, but her interactions with him lacked any real warmth. Frank was openly dismissive, barely acknowledging Brian's attempts at conversation. My mother's attitude toward Brian has worsened over time. She's made comments about how his health issues would limit my opportunities in life. When Brian had to cancel plans with them due to a flare-up, she suggested I find someone more dependable. I've always defended Brian, but I'll admit there were times I didn't push back as hard as I should have. I was terrified of damaging my relationship with my mother and losing the only parent I had left. But looking back, I see I was allowing her to mistreat the person I loved most in the world. This brings us to last week. My mother called, bubbling with excitement. She and Frank had gotten engaged and were planning a full wedding. I congratulated her, suppressing my conflicted feelings about Frank. Then she said she didn't want Brian to attend the wedding because his health issues could create a commotion, and she wanted the day to be perfect. I was stunned into silence for a moment. When I found my voice, I made it clear to her that this was completely unacceptable. Brian's condition is well managed, and he would never want to draw attention to himself during someone else's event. Plus, he'll be her in-law. How could she possibly consider excluding him? My mother became defensive, insisting she was just being sensible. She went on about how hard she had worked to organize this wedding and how she deserved everything to go perfectly. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told her that if Brian wasn't welcome, I wouldn't be attending either. This led to a huge argument. My mother accused me of being selfish and ungrateful. She launched into a long rant about how much she'd sacrificed as a single mother, how she'd put her life on hold for me, and how I owed it to her to be there on her special day. I countered that she was the only one being selfish by excluding my fiancé over something he couldn't control. The call ended with her in tears and me trembling with rage. Since then, she has alternated between guilt-tripping texts, "I guess I was a terrible mother if this is how you treat me," and screaming voicemails demanding an apology. Some family members have contacted me, suggesting I just give in to keep the peace. My Aunt Amanda recommended I attend the wedding alone and then have a separate celebration with Brian afterward. But the thought of attending an event that deliberately excludes the man I love makes me sick. I know my mother has been through a lot. Losing Dad was traumatic for both of us, and I'm glad she's found happiness again, even if I have reservations about Frank. However, I cannot condone her behavior toward Brian. This is about more than just one wedding. It's about her entire attitude toward him and her unwillingness to accept him as a long-term partner in my life. Am I being unreasonable? Should I give in and go to the wedding alone to please her, or should I stand firm? I'm torn and could use some outside perspective. Am I the bad guy for refusing to attend my mother's wedding unless my fiancé is also invited? Thank you all for your encouraging comments and messages. Reading everything helped me feel less crazy about the situation. A few days after my initial post, I was at home working on reports from my job at the local wildlife sanctuary when I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I was surprised to see my mother standing there when I opened it. For a brief moment, I thought she'd come to apologize, but as soon as I saw her face, I knew that wasn't the case. Her eyes were red and puffy, as if she'd been crying, but there was a harshness to her expression that reminded me of our worst arguments. I hesitated, but eventually decided to let her in. As soon as the door closed behind her, she launched into a hysterical speech about how upset she was that I would abandon her on her wedding day. She described how she had always envisioned having her only daughter by her side as she walked down the aisle and how she had fantasized about this day for years. I stood there, arms crossed, while she continued. A part of me wanted to comfort her because watching my mother cry has always been difficult for me, but a larger part of me was angry that she was trying to manipulate me this way. When she finally paused for breath, I spoke. I told her I wanted to attend her wedding, but not at the expense of excluding Brian. I reminded her that he was going to be her son-in-law and that deliberately not inviting him was hurtful, not only to him but also to me. That's when the situation shifted. My mother's emotional demeanor hardened, and she began explaining how she was only trying to protect me. She complained about things like, "What if he has an episode during the ceremony? You'll be so embarrassed." And she added, "I just don't want you to be burdened with taking care of him when you should be celebrating with me." I was furious. I made it clear to her that Brian is not a burden but my partner. I stated that the one thing that would humiliate me is having a mother who discriminates against people with medical conditions. She became enraged and accused me of preferring Brian over her. I pointed out that she was the one who forced me to choose in the first place by not inviting him. Then she played her trump card. She threatened to leave me out of her will if I didn't attend the wedding alone. I was stunned. In all of our disagreements over the years, she had never stooped so low. For a brief moment, I remembered my childhood, and how my mother used money or gifts to try to buy my affection or cooperation after a fight. I took a deep breath and told her she could keep the money. I was not for sale. I won't forget the look on her face, a mix of shock, rage, and something more, almost as if she was seeing me for the first time. Without saying anything further, she turned and left, slamming the door behind her. I sank onto the couch, exhausted. I must have sat there for hours, replaying the exchange in my mind. I kept thinking about my father, wondering what he would say if he could see us today. He had always disliked conflict, preferring to resolve it with a silly joke or an impromptu family game night. Later that evening, I received an email from Frank. The subject line stated, "Let's work this out," which made me roll my eyes. He wrote that he understood all perspectives and wished to propose a compromise. Brian could attend the ceremony, but leave before the reception so he wouldn't get exhausted. I was seething when I read his arrogant remarks. I responded by noting that banning Brian from half the event was still unacceptable discrimination. I also mentioned that if they were truly concerned about Brian's comfort, they would let him decide what he could handle. Frank replied shortly, claiming I was being difficult and that I should appreciate my mother's wish for a flawless day. He went on about how stressed out my mother was with the wedding planning, and how my obstinacy was making the situation worse. I blocked his email address after that. The following day, my phone rang. It was my Aunt Susan, my mother's younger sister. I almost didn't answer, but I've always been close to Susan growing up. She was more like a big sister to me, always ready to offer advice on boys or help with my math homework. Susan began by saying she had heard about the fight with my mother. She stated I was being too harsh and that I should be more understanding of my mother's situation as a widow. She reminded me of how difficult it was for my mother to learn to be both my father and my mother during the first few years after his death. I listened intently, tears welling in my eyes as I recalled those awful days. But then Susan said something that brought me back to the present. Sometimes we have to sacrifice a little for our family. Your mum deserves to have the wedding she wants. I took a deep breath and informed Susan that, while I appreciated her viewpoint, she was missing the point. This was about more than just one wedding. It was about my mother's overall treatment of Brian and her inability to embrace him as a long-term part of my life. I stated that by excluding Brian, my mother was refusing to accept our entire family. Susan groaned and commented, "You're so stubborn, just like your father." She intended that as a critique, I believe, but I interpreted it as a compliment. My father never tolerated unfair treatment of anyone. I remember him getting into intense arguments with relatives who made racist remarks during family events, refusing to back down even when it would have been easier to remain silent. After hanging up with Susan, I called Brian at work. Hearing his voice immediately made me feel calmer. I updated him on everything that had happened. He listened intently before telling me how proud he was of me for standing my ground. He even offered to skip the wedding personally to maintain peace, but I declined. This is about far more than a single event. This entire situation has been quite taxing, yet it has also provided some clarity. I'm seeing my mother and some family members in a new light, and I'm more certain than ever that Brian is the person I want to spend my life with. I'm sticking with my choice not to attend unless Brian is fully included and accepted. My mother made her decision, and she now has to live with the consequences. I will not compromise my values or our relationship to make her happy. My mother has allegedly been on a smear campaign, telling anyone who will listen that I am abandoning her and ruining her wedding by refusing to attend without Brian. She paints herself as the victim and me as the ungrateful daughter. Last week, I saw my cousin Alice at the farmer's market. Alice and I grew up together. Our mothers are sisters who were only a few months apart in age. As children, we were inseparable, sharing everything from clothes to our first sips of stolen wine at family gatherings. When Alice saw me, her eyes widened, and she rushed to my stall. I sell homemade jams and preserves made from fruit grown in my garden, a passion I learned from my father. I assumed she was happy to see me, but as soon as she opened her mouth, I realized it wasn't a friendly visit. Alice immediately started telling me how I needed to forgive my mother and stop being so selfish. I was shocked. Alice and I have always been close, and I expected her to understand my point of view. But it turns out my mother reached out to her first with her distorted version of events. I tried to explain my side, reminding Alice of all the times my mother had made disparaging remarks about Brian's health over the years, but Alice wasn't having it. She said, "Your mum has been alone for so long, can't you just give her this one day?" I replied that if it was truly about being there for my mother, Brian would be invited as well because he is going to be her son-in-law. Alice rolled her eyes and replied, "Come on, we both know he's not going to be around long term. Why risk ruining the wedding photos?" I was furious. I told her she had no right to make assumptions about my relationship and that her attitude was blatantly ableist. She became agitated and felt I was overreacting. I ended up packing up my stand and leaving early to avoid saying something I would later regret. That night, as I was stress baking another habit I picked up from my father, I received a group text from some extended family members with whom I'm not even close. My great-aunt Sylvia, whom I haven't seen since I was a teenager, and my mother's cousin Marvin, whom I don't think I'd recognize if I saw him on the street, were all telling me that I should do the right thing and go to the wedding alone. One particular message stood out. It came from my Uncle Greg, my father's younger brother. Greg and I were close when I was younger. He was the fun uncle who always got me awesome science kits for Christmas and taught me how to skip stones. But after Dad died, we drifted apart. Greg's message read, "Your father would be so disappointed in you." These statements felt like a physical blow. I found myself wondering, would my dad really be disappointed in me for standing up for my fiancée, for refusing to attend an event that discriminated against him? I reflected on my youth and all the lessons my father had taught me about sticking up for what is right. I remember him refusing to do business with a company that wouldn't hire women in management roles, even though it cost him a large contract. I thought about how he constantly went out of his way to make others feel included, particularly those who were often forgotten or excluded. That was the final straw. I responded to the entire group, explaining why I wasn't attending and how cruel and discriminatory my mother's behavior had been. I said that my father taught me to stand up for what is right, even when it is difficult, and that is precisely what I am doing. I ended by saying, anyone who supports excluding Brian is no longer welcome in my life. The fallout has been significant. I've received everything from angry messages to sobbing voicemails. My phone has been vibrating non-stop with notifications. However, a few family members have contacted me personally to express their support and admiration for my decision to take a stand. My nephew Aaron, who has type 1 diabetes, wrote a particularly moving comment about how much it means to him to see someone standing up to discrimination based on health concerns. Brian has been there for me through it all. He listened to me, rage and cry, comforted me when I needed it, and gave me space to process on my own. Seeing how nasty and judgmental my family can be has only strengthened my belief that he is the one I want to build a life with. We've started to consider eloping rather than having a large wedding. The thought of dealing with more family strife on what should be a joyful day is overwhelming. Furthermore, the idea of a small, intimate wedding centered on our love rather than appeasing others is starting to seem very appealing. I'm sticking firm on my decision. My mother and anyone who supports her actions can kick rocks. I'm done sacrificing my values to make others happy. Well, the wedding was last Saturday, as planned. I did not attend, but there have been some unexpected developments that I'd like to share. The night before the wedding, I received a call from my mother's best friend, Amanda. She has known me since I was a child, and has always felt like an aunt to me. Amanda was there for me during my awkward middle school years, my first heartbreak in high school, and when my father died. Amanda said she wanted to let me know about something that happened during the rehearsal dinner. Apparently, my mother had been drinking heavily and began bad-mouthing me to anyone who would listen. She was yelling horrible things about my being dead to her and that she wasted her life raising such an ungrateful brat. I was hurt but not shocked. What Amanda said next took me by surprise. Apparently, my mother's new husband, Frank, stood up and urged her to stop. He claimed she was embarrassing herself and should be ashamed of the way she treated me and Brian. According to Amanda, it became a huge scene, with my mother yelling at Frank and storming out. I wasn't sure how I felt about this revelation. On the one hand, I was relieved someone had finally stood up to my mother. On the other hand, it was difficult to hear how far she had fallen. I thanked Amanda for informing me and tried not to think about it anymore. The next morning, the day of the wedding, I received a text from Frank, of all people. He apologized for his role in everything and acknowledged how terrible it was to exclude Brian. He stated that he had only been doing what my mother wanted to keep her happy, but witnessing how nasty she was made him realize he had made a tremendous mistake. Frank explained that he understood if I couldn't forgive him, but he wanted me to know he was sorry. He also stated that he had requested Brian be invited to the wedding, even if it was last minute. He indicated the invitation was still open in case we decided to come. I showed Brian the message, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to go to see if this might be the turning point in our relationship with my mother. However, a large portion believed that it was too little, too late. Brian said he'd support whatever decision I made, but gently reminded me of all the anguish my mother had caused over the years. In the end, I chose not to go. I texted Frank back, thanking him for the apology and invitation, but explaining that I didn't think it would be a good idea to attend. I explained that I needed time before considering any form of relationship with him or my mother. Brian and I spent the day before the wedding enjoying a picnic near the lake where we first said, "I love you." It was a wonderful, peaceful day. In sharp contrast to what I had planned for the wedding, I heard through the grapevine that the wedding was tense. Several family members declined to attend in solidarity with me, which touched me, and my mother was apparently in a bad mood the entire time, snapping at everyone and grumbling about how awful everything was. It's been a few days, and I'm still Processing what's happened, I haven't heard directly from my mother since the wedding. Her silence hurts me in some ways, but also relieves me. I'm not sure I'm ready to confront her yet. I'm trying to focus on the good. My bond with Brian is stronger than ever. Some of my family members have shown their true colors, both positive and negative. And I've discovered that I'm stronger than I realized, capable of fighting for what's right even when it's extremely difficult. I don't know what the future holds for my connection with my mother. Part of me hopes that this will serve as a wake-up call for her to reflect on her behavior, but I'm not holding my breath. For the time being, my primary focus is on moving forward with those who truly love and support me. Brian,